CTBK gives executives and owners of mid-market businesses unparalleled confidence and clarity so you can focus on strategic objectives and organizational success. Their multidisciplinary advisors, accountants, and team members have a wealth of experience and are all available and responsive to each client to ensure the most effective advice, actions, and outcomes no matter the situation or complexity level. That experience base and one-team approach, combined with integrated and efficient way of operating, enable them to be truly proactive partners, doing the best thing for their client every time. Visit ctbk.com or call 716-630-2400 to learn how CTBK can work for you.
I'm Bucky Gleason, and you're listening to Tim Graham and Friends. Tim Graham has friends?
It's Tim Graham and Friends, brought to you by CTBK, CPAs and Business Consultants. I'm Tim Graham of The Athletic, here with my co-host Jonah Bronstein of Bronstein Sports Plus. And Jonah, I want to just mention that I did the satchel this week. That's my mailbag over at The Athletic. And I let submissions remain open for several days because the initial questions I really didn't have much interest in answering. After 4 days of the satchel being open for submissions, there were 3 mentions of Bill's first round pick, Max Hairston. And one of those 3 mentions was really a question about Tre'Davious White. There was 1 mention of second round pick TJ Sanders, the defensive tackle. 0 mentions of the third round pick, Arkansas edge rusher Landon Jackson. But there were dozens of questions and comments about Brandon Beane's interview with WGR. And as I'm scrolling through the mailbag and I'm looking for things to answer, it was, look, it's not something that I wanted to go with, but it was the dominant conversation. And I don't know if that's a topic in and of itself, Jonah, the fact that just days after the draft, the prevailing topic in Western New York sports wasn't about really the new players the Bills drafted. It was, did Brandon Beane make a mistake? Was Brandon Beane justified? Was Brandon Beane whining? Did he put those guys in their place? And by those guys, I mean the WGR 550 morning show with Jeremy White and Joe DiBiase. I'm not leaving their names out. I mean, they had a kerfuffle and it took the headlines. And I don't know if that's good or bad or just a statement on sports media these days. And we haven't spoken about it. I've been on the mend. I lost my voice during the draft and had some sick days. So I don't know your opinion on this. And I wanted to save asking for right now. What's your take just on this as a phenomenon?
I think I have several different opinions that kind of range. I don't know if you're so sure if you want my take on kind of what Brandon Beane said and the football aspect of it. And I think I'm more, well, I should say, I don't really like that it became such a big journalism story. I didn't really think it was that big of a deal in terms of a Bills story, a football story. It was something to pay attention to if you're a Bills fan, but it wasn't I thought, a big news story even within the Bills beat. And the way it became a big news story outside of just Buffalo and Bills football, I thought was overblown and really just goes to show the magnitude of the NFL and something, I don't want to say unique, but it doesn't happen every day that a general manager in the NFL says something like that on a radio show. So NFL general manager curses on local radio show to defend his draft picks is a huge story, no matter who it is and what team it is. But I didn't think it was a big Bills story or a big Buffalo sports content of the discussion story that there's this, a little bit of a disconnect between whether the Bills should have drafted a wide receiver or not.
Quick aside, the linguist in you, Jonah, is bitching a curse word?
I thought it was a adjective, like it's a bitchin' skateboard you got there.
Well, yeah, I think that with an apostrophe at the end, no G. but bitching to mean complaining.
It's a
Or
verb in this sense. Brandon Beane
yeah,
was verbing.
I don't think it's a bad word. Everybody kind of censored it in their
It's a
coverage,
bad word for 8 a.m. on the radio.
including New York Times / The Athletic. We did B and then the hyphens. Yeah, I think really what it is, it's a testament that friction sells, and it is the shiny object media that dominates political discourse, but especially sports. And the way I extrapolated it for the sake of my intro for the Satchel before I eased into answering these questions that people had regarding Brandon Beane's interview with WGR on Monday morning was I likened it to what we're seeing with Shadur Sanders. Now, he has been the number one topic since the draft. He wasn't the first quarterback selected. He wasn't even the first Cleveland Browns quarterback that was selected. He wasn't the first Colorado player selected. He wasn't even the first Sanders selected. The Bills selected defensive tackle TJ Sanders, no relation, before Shadur Sanders was taken. And yet this fourth string rookie is owning the headlines in the NFL. And of course it's intrigue. There's some scandal. Was it done was it calculated by the NFL teams almost in collusion to put this punk in his place? Was it to right the wrongs of his pre-draft visits where he treated them like recruiting visits instead of job interviews? All the different racial elements of why, or was it Sanders' kid? Yes, I get it. There's a lot of hot topicry going on when it comes to Shadur Sanders. And I saw it similarly with this Brandon Beane discussion. Had a great conversation with my class at Canisius University on Monday night. I teach sports journalism there. And I played the interview for the class, although only a handful of the 22 students hadn't heard it already. So, but I needed to play it for everybody. And then we had a discussion. I told them, hey, listen to this interview, not as a sports fan, not as somebody who has an opinion regarding who the Bills took in the draft, who they didn't take, whether you wanted receiver over cornerback or did they need linebackers, whatever. Don't listen to it in that sense. Listen to it from a sports journalism standpoint. Listen to it from the radio show's perspective, how the hosts are handling it, how Brandon Beane is handling it, and how this probably projects into a Bills PR situation. What do you think the Bills as an organization think of this interview? Are they happy? Are there people doing fist bumps like, yeah, that's our guy going out there standing up for his scouts and his draft and his receiver room? Or is that, oh, damn it, I wish Brandon hadn't gone and done that? And it was a great conversation. I mean, I'll be happy to get into some of their thoughts, but Jonah, what from that standpoint, you also teach college level sports journalism. What are your thoughts on it just from almost an academic standpoint?
Well, as much as I didn't like how big of a story it became, as a local story, as somebody who does cover the Bills and doesn't interact with Brandon Beane nearly as much as other people on that beat and yourself and people that have covered the team a bit longer than I have. But having been there, I was there all 3 days for the draft. I actually love that Brandon Beane said this. I think as a journalist and as us in the media and by extension, probably the public and the fans, we want people like Brandon Beane in positions that he holds to be more candid and open and colorful every time they talk to us. And sometimes it's not in Brandon Beane's best interest to give us his honest thoughts, but that doesn't mean that we still don't want that. And you have to try to craft your questions in ways or build relationships in ways to get newsmakers to give you these honest thoughts. And it's rare sometimes with people in the NFL or people in high power positions outside of sports. I wish he would have said those things in the press room when we were all there on Friday night or at the end of the draft on Sunday. I don't know if it's beneficial to the public relations department and the Bills and their marketing and overall. And there's a discussion to have about why Brandon Beane got agitated enough to feel like he had to make this or blow off this steam on the radio.
I think, Jonah, and I just your last 2 points, I think I can address those. I think it comes with that morning show having turned into a bit / brand of theirs, that the wide receiver train, it's almost like the Group Hal and the Tank. I mean, I don't want to conflate those things, but sports talk radio isn't necessarily hardcore journalism. I mean, it is entertainment. There's that aspect of it, and they have a show. And the wide receiver train, this campaign that they've had, I think was eating at Beane, because nobody in the press room on Thursday, Friday, Saturday who's sitting there to ask questions of Brandon Beane is on the wide receiver train, using finger quotes. They're there to cover, they're regular journalists. Yes, there are people in that room who write columns and give their opinion, but the radio hosts don't come down there and ask those questions. So this is his opportunity finally, I think, and this is what I haven't spoken to Brandon about this, but as an observer of human nature for 53 years, and also a professional sports writer for 30 years, or however long it's been, 35 years almost. I think he was just, these were the guys who have been nagging him on the air about this, and he's big on messaging, and he wouldn't have had this opportunity or any reason to say these things to the reporters who were there in person. And this was his way, or this was finally, he probably snapped a little bit. I don't know if he went into the conversation with a plan to do it, but I mean, who does he, do you think he should have just had a soliloquy maybe on one of the news conferences just to get it out of the way?
No. He did indicate in his comments on the radio that there was a vein of questioning from the reporters at the draft about wide receivers that seems to put some of these thoughts in his head before the radio show. And he also insinuated that he was listening to Jeremy and Joe, and they were talking about not drafting a wide receiver. Now, I have not heard the audio from what they were talking about before Brandon Beane was on the radio. I read on Twitter that there wasn't a lot of talk about it, or it was mild talk about the wide receiver train, that this did seem to be Brandon Beane calling back to prior conversations he had heard on the radio about that Jeremy and Joe had. I could be wrong about that, but that's some of what I picked up on Twitter about this. Was not a morning where Jeremy White was going off about the wide receiver train like he does at other times. So I thought the timing of it was weird. The reaction, it's an overreaction to criticism of not drafting a wide receiver for a team that's as good as the Bills are and as good as they were on offense. And if you're Brandon Beane, if I'm Brandon Beane, I think I'm laughing off that line of questioning and being like, see you in September, we're going to be just fine, which is sort of what he did last year when they were a lot weaker at wide receiver and a lot more legitimate questions about who's going to replace Stephon Diggs. And he said, it's a long off season. You'll see, which is all he really needed to say. Now, at the same time, it was great content. I love it. It got everybody a headline on Monday that I don't think everybody deserved because it wasn't all that newsworthy. But Brandon Beane was a fun character in the NFL media ecosystem for an afternoon, and thank you for that. Anybody, us and anybody else who got work and got content out of that.
Yeah, well, some of the discussion though is a lot of fans were viewed it dimly, that this is, he has thin skin. Is this a problem? Is this insight into Brandon Beane's personality that we haven't really seen before? Is he being whiny? Is he the one bitching?
I think we've seen this from Brandon Beane in different ways. He doesn't do it a lot, but he's done it subtly. He did it when he was defending Josh Allen from that overrated narrative that came out of those, stories or polls or whatever that was last offseason. And I like Brandon Beane, and I think he does this in a genuine way, but he's very competitive. And I think a lot of people in his position in sports could get competitive with radio hosts who are critical of draft picks if that's what his game is. And I don't think Brandon Beane was maybe as angry with them as much as he was trying to be like, I was right the last time you guys doubted me, and I'm right again. And that's just the way he expressed that kind of competitiveness and feeling that he might have about these particular subjects.
I want to apologize, Joan. I don't know if you're picking up on this. I'm getting a little audio problem. I think it's on my end. So I want to apologize for any technical difficulties that viewers are listening. Just a little vibration every now and then keeps getting picked up. And I think that's me. But I don't want to stop recording. And I think we'll soldier through unless it gets really bad. But I think a sports journalism point to make is that probably the reason why you didn't see Brandon Beane be as feisty on Saturday when asked about receivers or similar topics, who they did or did not go after. And he said he was feeling that, and he said that in the Monday morning interview with WGR, that he had gotten a sense of it on that Saturday, as you referenced. The difference being is that the people who are in that room are around, and he gets to see them and talk to them face to face. He communicates with them. He's accessible to them. You put in a request to talk to Brandon Beane, you're probably going to get approved unless he's really under the gun. And I think that is the big difference. They always talk about the reporters who are there on a regular basis versus the ones who aren't, who speak from a distance or who aren't around. And I think you can get comfortable in that role as the commentator / sniper. And we're going to have Brandon Beane come on, and he's going to yuck it up with us. And the interview began as pretty jovial, like small talk. And Brandon Beane came in hot. Like, I think that he wouldn't talk to people like that who are around, because I think there's a deeper respect there, or a deeper sense of obligation that, hey, at least these people are around. And that's just that's a journalism thing. That's not a Brandon Beane thing. That's just kind of how it works. You used to hear it all the time regarding Jerry Sullivan and the Sabres. Bucky Gleason could be as hard on the Sabres as anybody. And then Jerry Sullivan would come in once a month or in the playoffs and write his columns, and the players just hated it because you didn't know when he was going to come back. Bucky Gleason was going to be in the locker room the next day or 3 or 4 times a week, whereas Jerry would swoop in, hit the detonator, and then walk away for a month, and then you wouldn't see it. And the players resent that. And when you're not around, that's a thing. So I think maybe Brandon not opening up like that was just kind of a respect for those who are there every day type thing.
I mean, all of that is very much true. But another major difference here is that in the press room after the draft, there's 6 to 8 cameras on a podium pointed at him, and there's a dozen or so reporters in the room, and it's a much different setting for answering questions and speaking to the public. It's live streamed on the Bills' own Twitter. So Brandon Beane is talking to the Bills fan and NFL universe as much as he's talking to any individual in that room. Whereas calling into a WGR radio show on a Monday morning on a phone, so he's not FaceTiming or Zooming with these people. We see them in this video that's gone around, but he can't see what we see right there. And it's probably a feeling more of like, I'm only talking to Jeremy White, Joe DiBiase, and whoever's listening to this radio show live right now. And that's kind of the case if he doesn't say anything that goes viral, but he says something that gets picked up on, and then everybody listens to the replay. I mean, how many people were listening live when that happened? There were some, but not nearly as many as, who reacted to it as the day went along.
But he's savvy, and he knew what he was doing, and he knew that was going out to the fans. I mean, that's still the Bills' flagship station, and it's a highly rated morning show, regardless of format. I will say this, another sports journalism point, and this is why I'm talking about this now. I know I started this by saying I'm rolling my eyes at this as a topic. This as Brandon Beane versus, as this is a sports journalism story to me. And that's where I think we're looking at it. Really, I mean, that's kind of how a lot of people were. But when it first happened on Monday, I just kind of rolled my eyes, but it was an opportunity to talk to my students about it that night while it was fresh. It was a great for engagement within the class because everybody had heard it. Everybody had thoughts on it from all kinds of perspectives. Now here it is a few days later. And I do know that there are people who listen to this podcast and seem to enjoy this type of conversation that we have about how the sausage is made. And I know that I've brought it up on this program before regarding the fine line in journalism between the reporter and the commentator, or the reporter and the columnist. I almost said communist for some reason. Read into that what you will. But I've always been a believer that it's dangerous for the reporter to also be somebody who deals in heavy opinion. Now, the lines have blurred so much since I got into this business. You're almost required to be an analyst, and with analysis, a lot of times comes some opinion or reaching a conclusion in some way, hot take, all that type of stuff. The people who cover the team as beat reporters are experts, and their opinion does matter. But if Sal Capaccio is doing that same exact interview over the phone on Monday morning, that doesn't happen. Brandon Beane doesn't have that conversation with Sal Capaccio, again, because he's around and he's there. And Sal's going to have his way of doing it. And also Sal is not the engineer or the conductor of the wide receiver train. Here these guys are. So it's interesting that you have the coach usually, and this isn't unusual for the Buffalo market. I think this is the case probably in most, if not every NFL market, where the coach or the general manager who has a weekly radio spot is going to be calling in with people who are opinion leaders. They're people who are constantly hot taking or just giving opinion. It doesn't even have to be hot take in a pejorative sense, but the opinion people. And that's kind of tricky. So you have people who then hang up on the general manager and then have opinions on him all week, and then answer the phone again a week later and ask questions, trying to do some straight up journalism and not expect some pushback at some point, or a joust or a blow up. So that's anyways, I don't know if you have thoughts on it from that dynamic of people who are constantly banging a drum all week on any opinion, whether it be positive or negative. And then let's talk to the general manager we've either been bagging on all week or praising all week, or a mixture of both. But, like Kevin Adams calling into these shows. I mean, it's different.
Oh.
When if Kevin Adams had done the same thing, I mean, he'd be getting totally destroyed. But that's also
absolutely
the power between being a winner and being a loser.
If
Anyways, a
Joe
lot of
Schoen did
dynamics
this in
here that
New
I
York
find
radio,
fascinating.
if a lot of general managers in the NFL or any sport in less secure positions did this in any market, especially a bigger market than Buffalo, it would seriously dent their job security. And it would be something that would be called back upon when the team was struggling and those type of questions and stories came about. That's not happening with Brandon Beane. I don't think it's going to happen with Brandon Beane. But, if this was a decade ago and the Bills were in the middle of a playoff drought, or, you're a hockey general manager in the middle of a playoff drought and you have this kind of reaction on the radio, that could be the beginning of the end of, for that person.
Brandon Beane has pelts on the wall, as they like to say in sports.
I got to think that any general manager in any position with this radio thing really doesn't need to pay attention to what the opinion people on the talk radio show are saying, unless you're entertained by that. I do realize that influences a lot of fan opinions, and maybe it's beneficial to be somewhat aware of what the prevailing theories are, but knowing which host is on the wide receiver train or which one's not, or which one argues for you or against you, when oftentimes these shows are set up to have, differing opinions and go back and forth. So there's really no sense in, it almost sounds like professional wrestling. Like, I will give good answers to the radio host that agrees with me, and I will give bad answers or mean answers to the radio host that does not. I mean, you're playing into the radio show's hands, and you're engaged. It's like LeBron calling in and debating with Stephen A. Smith live on their show. That would be tremendous for the show, and it only encourages more critical commentary if you're going to be able to have this debate back and forth with the general manager of the football team himself. I mean, I don't know. I guess it's must-listen radio the next time Brandon Beane calls in to that morning show to hear how the tenor of the conversation goes. And they should probably ask exclusively wide receiver related questions to get back on the train and see if they can keep this bit going and in the news cycle for more than 1 week.
my students lauded Jeremy White and Joe DiBiase for keeping the interview on the air for 18 minutes, which is kind of their job. It could have totally devolved into something else, but they artfully changed the subject and was able to get 18 minutes of conversation out of Brandon Beane and analysis on all the different draft picks, before circling back and then saying goodbye to Brandon Beane and then declaring we will not be belittled. To which I thought that was funny because no, you were belittled. You don't get to determine whether or not you were belittled. The guy doing the belittling gets to decide. He belittled. Whether you agree or not, but Brandon Beane certainly belittled the work by referring to fantasy football. And I know you have a show to do, and just pretty much reminding them that you're not in the real world. I do real football. You just talk about it. And I referenced it in the satchel. It was just an updated comment of Jim Mora's famous, "You think you know, but you don't know, and you never will." Okay. That really, that famous, his second most famous quote from his coaching days.
What I find kind of crazy about it is that there is a conversation to have about the Bills wide receivers, or there was a conversation to have about the Bills wide receivers not drafting one in the early rounds, drafting one in the 7th round, working out Elijah Moore, signing Elijah Moore, the competition for the 5th or 6th wide receiver spot. And I think you can have that conversation and ultimately conclude the Bills might be better at the position than they were the year before and have a favorable opinion of it, but there's a debate to have. But the wide receiver question should have came up in that interview, and Brandon Beane possibly deflecting and being like, "Hey, we drafted a lot of defense here. And that's what we're excited about." He doesn't even have to defend that, but he can like spin it back to the defense, where in this case, Brandon Beane introduces wide receiver into the interview before he's asked.
Right.
And the radio hosts have to spin it back into, like, "Wait, you drafted some good defensive guys." I mean, what the hell? What's going on with that?
Yeah, I think it's an unforced error by Brandon Beane. And really, I think the big losers in this are the receivers, because especially Keon Coleman, because he's already under the microscope, and he faced critical comments from both Brandon Beane and Sean McDermott after the season about needing to be more dedicated as a professional. And now here this guy is 33rd overall pick. Hey, what are you going to do now? And also Curtis Samuel, who's had his injury problems. He probably would not rather be under the microscope also. He'd rather slide into OTAs or slide into training camp and try to get his legs underneath him. Joshua Palmer now becomes a critical offseason signing based on public perception, whereas receiver prior to this interview was just a talking point, an offseason issue or something just to discuss. Now it's going to be front and center, and production is going to be looked at on a week-to-week basis. The other thing I wanted to mention, also the other dynamic about this, again, from a sports journalism standpoint, is regardless of what side anybody was on, whether Brandon Beane should not have brought this up from his own perspective, from a Bills PR standpoint, and I stress this to my students, it was a reminder, because you could see the commentary out there on social media, that people just love seeing the media kicked in the nuts. They love to see us knock down a couple of pegs. And it's something that you're going to have to get used to if you want to be in this business, is dunking on the media, putting the media in its place. And I don't blame it. I mean, I blame them because we do work hard. And obviously I take pride in my work and pride in my vocation. But there is a point where, it gets kind of silly to plant the flag on the unknown and just to have an opinion for the sake of having an opinion, and making that a brand of, this is what you must do. You must draft Josh Rosen. You must tank for Connor McDavid or Jack Eichel. You must hire Lindy Ruff. You must, or what, and then there's all kinds of, examples over the years. You must, trade up for Sammy Watkins. You must, whatever. There's just, everybody's got to plant a flag to, this is the way to do it. And anybody who disagrees is misguided or dumb. And so a lot of people like to see the media, the people who are finger quotes in the real world of the NFL as players, coaches, executives, put the media in their place for being blowhards. And I think we deserve it a lot of times, especially with the way the business has gone, with all the blowhardery being our currency these days, right? It goes back to Chuck Dickerson. I mean, this isn't new,
yeah.
but it's, you see it on the major networks overtake the fact that it used to be, there were these opinionated people as part of an organization. Now the opinions are the organization in many cases. You see Stephen A. Smith on a panel interviewing President Trump the other day.
Sure.
It's gotten wild.
Well, you can say this, but you can say we deserve it, and I'm not going to debate that.
Sometimes,
yeah, or
oftentimes.
nay. No, that's not the point. Like, whether we deserve it or not, all of us should want these kind of, I'd rather have a combative relation. I don't want to say combative relationship, but for the quotes that you're going to get, the sound bites you're going to get, especially if it's a one-on-one or exclusive, like, you can hate me all you want. You can scream in my face and curse. But if you're going to say the more colorful, interesting, honest, introspective thing about a topic, I'd rather that's how you feel than the other way around. Or if you're only going to say nice things, I mean, and I give Jerry Sullivan a lot of credit when he was in these press rooms, because he was willing to ask questions and express opinions that got these people mad at him. For a while, I think this changed toward the end, but for a while, that would get him better reactions and better quotes and better.
Well, that's a different conversation.
It didn't really end that way now that I think about it. It is an entirely different conversation. But I mean, the whole, like, you deserve, I mean, if it's off the record and these people are just browbeating us and being mean or like, then that's not as desirable. But if it's on the record, like, give me more. That's
well,
great.
I think there's a way to
tell me how you feel.
There's a big difference between provoking an interview subject and exploring a topic with an interview subject. And I do agree that Brandon Beane's interview on WGR on Monday morning was different. And sometimes everything, especially when it comes to the draft, my feelings on the draft and how much wasted breath there is and wasted energy on mocks and analysis on players that will never wear the uniform, or even if you do draft them, they don't make the team. I mean, again, the NFL draft industrial complex is a powerful engine.
But like, let me real quick. Joey Votto screamed in my face he was joking, but in tried to jump scare me, screaming in my face in the Biden's press room last summer. And I didn't walk out of that like mad at him or thinking like, he got me there. I was like, that was great. I was really confused. I was trying to figure out why the line of questioning led him to react that way. But I was much more walking out of there glad that he did that than feeling like, I asked
right. But you didn't go in there to provoke. You went when you use Jerry as an example of, that's not necessarily the best journalism. And we've done whole shows on that, actually, about interviewing and how you're supposed to extract information from somebody, not get a reaction, not just get them to give you a soundbite or the explosive thing. And now it would take needing to know that but there's ways to explore or be original. And plus, it's not as though WGR planned this, so it's not even like to say, well, look how good WGR, they pulled this off, that they didn't maneuver this out of Brandon Beane. They were shocked as anybody listening that Brandon Beane was in this mood. They wanted to yuck it up at the beginning of this interview. And even when Brandon was started off hot, Jeremy White's laughing because he thinks maybe it's a put on at some point. And it's not until Brandon Beane says, no, wait, let me finish. You guys have had your chance to talk. And then as a listener, you're like, oh shit, here he goes. Like, this guy's not fooling around. But again, that lends itself to, I think, a point made earlier, is that nobody had even asked a question yet. It's almost like like I said, doing an interview with people who comment on you all the time and then have them conduct the interview kind of lends itself to things like this happening, of getting pushback. But I don't think you go into it like Coach Dickerson did, or like Jerry Sullivan often did, going into a situation looking for to provoke. And, and it came up. I know I keep mentioning my class at Canisius, but Marty Baran spoke to my class about a month ago. And he brought up something that I hadn't really known. And this is, hopefully I'm not telling a tale out of school. I mean, he told a classroom, literally, I'd be telling a tale out of school. But he had mentioned how Jerry had asked in an interview, do you think that, are you something along the lines of, are you trying to get your coach fired? Because Marty was going through a rough patch, and Jerry showed up like he did, like he wasn't there every day, like Bucky was, as I alluded to earlier. And then here you have in a big scrum when things are going bad, the local columnist saying something like that. And he says that he has never forgiven Jerry for that. I didn't know that he had a career-long rift with Jerry over that, but he's like, why would you ask that? I mean, that's not, again, your reason is to ask is to try to get the blow up. And I don't think that that's honest, the most honest form of journalism. It is a form of journalism, 60 Minutes, and people like Dan Rather, or not Dan Rather, but Mike Wallace, and people like have made careers over the gotcha interview, kicking your foot through the door and sticking your microphone in the, underneath the allegedly corrupt politician's chin and asking him, something on the spot. Yeah, that gives you a big moment, but it's not necessarily the most honest form of journalism. But again, we're overlapping, and it's a different tangent. That's not necessarily what happened on Monday morning. Here, I thought we were going to breeze through this topic. We never breeze through a topic.
Has anybody yelled at Jeremy White like that since Jerry Sullivan was on the radio with him last?
I don't know. And I don't listen often. Would it make headlines if somebody had? I mean, I don't know. I don't know. I mean, I think that Sean McDermott has been prickly in some interviews with WGR. I think that there's some hosts that he doesn't want to talk with on the station, which is why his show started off on, I think, one show and is now on another. There are things like that, but I don't know. I'll be honest. But it's also another, again, sports journalism. This is the Bills' flagship station. Brandon Beane that's probably baked into a contract somewhere that they get the GM every so often during the season and then after big events. I mean, who does he talk to next time? Or I don't know, probably the same guys. My prediction is that he'll be on again soon and they'll laugh about it. But I don't think that he was not in a good mood. I mean, he obviously wanted to vent, and he wanted to vent on that show, and he knew what he's doing, but I don't think that necessarily meant it was the right thing to do. Just because he knew he was doing it doesn't mean it wasn't a mistake. Because I think it brought undue pressure, and it makes the receivers, they're going to be talked to every day. There are going to be stories written. I mean, that's going to be the trending story to do. Other than Josh Allen, what's Josh Allen up to? Where's he going on his honeymoon? Every move that Josh Allen makes, this number 2 storyline on this team for this upcoming season is going to be wide receivers. Dalton Kincaid probably likes this, although he's receiver adjacent. He's receiver adjacent, but still, this gives him
certainly
some cover.
Wide receiver sympathetic. He's on their side in this.
There you go. One guy who is probably happy he's leaving this stinking business, and for things like this, he will not miss. The Buffalo News' Mark Gaughan, after 43 and a half years at the Buffalo News, announced his retirement this week. Mark is an all-time great guy, an all-time great journalist, former president of the Pro Football Writers of America, award-winning, Emmy-nominated. That's one of my favorite things to say about Mark Gaughan, because of his video feature that they did at the Buffalo News. I don't think they do it anymore, but it got nominated for an Emmy. Mark Gaughan, just one of the classy dudes and classy journalists, never really took to social media, was just old school about it and just did the job. Nobody's going to complain about anything Mark Gaughan ever did. Your thoughts, I guess, Jonah, on Mark Gaughan. And you grew up reading Mark Gaughan as a local. I didn't know Mark Gaughan until I was a coworker of his with the Buffalo News starting in 2000.
Certainly that's the case, that I was reading Mark Gaughan long before I met Mark Gaughan, probably in the early 2000s when he was still covering the Bills. I got to know Mark better and really enjoyed his time covering college sports for the Buffalo News, which is about 3-4 years maybe. And I know he had covered colleges before that, and he talks about how it was like the losingest era in college sports that ever happened in Western New York with the 4 major teams, big 4 teams. And then he came back to the beat during some really good seasons, I think the early NATO tiers and things like that. And I got to work alongside him a lot more. I really enjoyed his work on that beat. I think a lot of people, coaches, especially in basketball that were covered by Mark, and football too, appreciated his experience and professionalism from having covered the NFL for so long and then bringing that not to a lesser beat, but to a beat where you usually have younger writers coming up. So I think there was a lot of appreciation from Mark's time on that beat, and then he went back to covering the Bills, and I stayed close with him. I mean, I said this about Jerry Sullivan as well, but like Mark and Jerry are 2 of my favorite people in sports journalism, but they're also friends of mine. They're both in my fantasy basketball league. I think I'm going to see both of them to watch NBA basketball games sometime soon here, and maybe kind of toast to Mark's retirement. I hope I see them both again, and Mark specifically again. I'm also in a golf pool Mark runs. So, but even if I had never met Jerry or Mark, I was also big fans of the way they did their job and covered Buffalo sports and the Bills specifically. And it's a lot different. You could draw kind of a big contrast, not to make this a whole podcast about Jerry Sullivan, but between an opinionate column person and the way Mark has, for many, many years, was the beat writer and the classic beat writer for the Buffalo News covering the Bills, and a Hall of Fame voter. And kind of, I think he set the playbook for how people like Jay Skursky and anybody else who covers the Bills beat do it now, is from reading Mark Gaughan and following the way he covered that team. And not to say he didn't write columns and couldn't write opinionated pieces, because he did that too, but not as often. But later on in his career covering the Bills for BM Blitz and things like that, he did things a little bit differently and had a analytical, watching the game film style that I don't think anybody else does quite like him, or really as well as him on this beat. So, I haven't talked to him in depth. I think he's retiring. I hope he's, starting his own Substack and going to do his version of covering the Bills or local sports or writing about sports. If you're in his golf pool league, which I think maybe at least 1 or 2 of our listeners might be, he writes a golf notes column for, the weekly recaps or when you have the golf tournaments. So maybe you can hire out Mark to do that for your fantasy league. He'll kind of just analyze it and write a weekly email with all the storylines, but it's tremendous. So I hope Mark keeps writing, even if he's no longer writing for the Buffalo News and local newspapers.
Yeah, I think that Mark is the greatest teammate I've ever worked with. And he is seamless in any way, whether it came to being a travel companion, whether it came to collaborating on a story, whether it meant sharing a phone number or a contact, making an introduction. A lot of things that you would think are pretty easy to do, they aren't for some people. And Mark was generous with his wherewithal, his depth of knowledge, his ability, the history of the game, the X's and O's. You mentioned that, Jonah. Nobody else really does that. I think that the only other people who do that you're going to find on the different podcasts that specialize in that, Cover One, the different, shows that are really good at that. Mark, the Buffalo News doesn't have it, and won't anymore, barring whatever they do, with the position or the vacancy. I don't know. An amazing sense of humor, a dry sense of humor, cerebral, quiet, because you don't know when he's going to say it. He sits there and he goes about his business, and then you think he's just in his own little zone, but he knows what's going on around him, and he'll just make a comment that is just hilarious. And one of the worst drivers of all time, a comically bad driver. I'm just trying to think of the things about Mark Gaughan, but he is beloved as a teammate, as a human, all that stuff. He's just top notch, with the exception of his driving.
So that comment you just made about his driving and one you made before made me want to tell one of my favorite Mark Gaughan stories. This story is true. I'm going to change a name or two though. So you mentioned him being a great teammate. I've never really been Mark's teammate. I wrote for the Buffalo News at various points in time, but not really about the Bills or the same beat, and really worked with Mark in the way anybody else did. But I felt like he was a teammate just covering the same sports as him when I'm writing for the Niagara Gazette and he's writing for the Buffalo News, or what I do now and he's covering the Bills. I've gotten that great teammate feeling and acceptance and appreciation from him, even though we weren't teammates. And
he's the type of guy who would help a competitor probably just as quickly as he would help a teammate.
Sure. And, so there was a time or two when I've driven with Mark as kind of a favor to me, or, hopped in the car. And, probably the first time, I think, we went to Canton for Andre Reed getting inducted into the Hall of Fame. And the Bills play a game the next day. One of our colleagues who was there had parked somewhere in kind of the fan lot and needed a ride back. And Mark was nice enough to give this person a ride.
And this person is probably listening.
This person could be listening. And a very nice person, one of the nicest people he also met. Probably a great teammate too. I've never been a great teammate with this person, never worked with this person. Jay Skurski's in the front seat. I'm in the back seat with this person. We dropped this person off. But having to go into the thick of the fan parking put us in a traffic situation coming out. So it took a while to get out of there. Then we maybe made a wrong turn, or we're just turned around where we had to make a wrong turn. And then we're lost and we're out of the way. Mark Gaughan's making illegal U-turns and just flying around the road. I'm getting sick. I'm smashing into the side of the doors in the back. I'm swaying back and forth. And Mark, who's the nicest guy and really doesn't, say mean things about people very often, but sometimes he might, just yelps out and he's like, "That good for nothing John Warrow." It wasn't John Warrow, but we'll say that was the name. It's just like, it's been over a decade, probably maybe closer to 15 years now, and I'll still think about that good for nothing John Warrow, every time I hear this person's name.
He'll be missed, and on the beat, in terms of his work and just his presence. I hope he does write something, because he's a talented writer, and some of his best writing is in the off the cuff stuff that is circulated among us. You're right. But my guess is he wouldn't, unless he gets totally bored.
He could write on Facebook or, Blue Sky or whatever he wants to write on social media, just for friends and family, as much as he wants, or emails, anything like that.
Yeah, but I don't see him as a Substack guy. Although that would be good. He was the golf writer at the Buffalo News for a long time. That's a passion. I don't think he was ever happier, or at least that was my sense. I didn't know him the early years, or when he was covering the Super Bowl teams and all that stuff. But in my 25 years of knowing him, he never seemed happier than when he was covering college sports. I think the Bills and the drought and the Geron years and Ralph and all of that just wore him out. And he was reinvigorated when he went to cover colleges, and he did some amazing work too, because to have a writer or a journalist of his quality now covering colleges, it was a shot in the arm for him professionally and for the newspaper to have that. I guess just to wrap up here, Jonah, I know that you're maybe going to do double duty, maybe try to do a Deion Sanders and play for both the Braves and the Falcons tonight. The Bandits opened their semifinal series against Vancouver at KeyBank Center, but Daemen University volleyball tournament taking place on campus, and it's a big tournament, which you have with volleyball. A lot of people don't know it. They're really D2 is D1 when it comes to volleyball, And so Penn State and nationally ranked teams come in and all that. And now that one of those events is happening at Daemen this weekend. So what's your synopsis of trying to pull this off?
Well, you said it's a big tournament. It's for men's college volleyball. It's the biggest tournament. It's the Division I National Collegiate Volleyball Tournament, they call it, not NCAA for some reason. But yes,
Oh, it's even
Daemen,
bigger than I thought.
it's the tournament. It's the big dance. Daemen University is a Division II athletics program, and every other sport, they're Division II. But because of the number of men's volleyball teams there are in Division I and Division II, there is no divisional divide there. There is a Division III, but it's just Division I and Division III. Daemen plays in a league that gets a automatic bid, but that's new this year. That wasn't the case even a year ago. But so Daemen, a Division II school that didn't even have men's volleyball since the start of the program 6 years ago, is hosting Penn State, a two-time national champion that's been to 35 NCAA men's college volleyball tournaments at home at Lumsden Gymnasium in what it was the play-in round to get to the 18 bracket at Ohio State. That the winner of this match will play Hawaii, number 2 team in the country. And that his here in Daemen tonight, I think it's pretty remarkable. Not just the first NCAA tournament match that Daemen's ever played or a men's volleyball team from West New York's ever played, but doing it at home against Penn State. That can't happen in another sport for Daemen to do that. And even for any other school, getting a school like Penn State on your home floor in a postseason NCAA tournament game is pretty remarkable.
UB football couldn't get Penn State to come and play, or maybe even basketball.
Yeah, right. And not for a bowl game or an NCAA tournament game. I mean, in basketball, the NCAA tournament's all at neutral sites, but Daemen in the Division II men's basketball tournament was able to host games. That's pretty unbelievable. Daemen has only been Division II for a decade, and now they've hosted the the Division II men's basketball tournament and now the men's volleyball tournament. And so tickets for this, I was told, I checked and saw they were sold out in a couple of minutes. I was told 45 seconds. I don't know how you can really calculate it there. I mean, I guess you can. They were available and then they weren't. But less than a minute was how quickly the tickets sold out Thursday morning when they went on sale. Because it's a small gym. They only put about 500 people in there. But as soon as those tickets went on sale, people snapped that up because Daemen hosted UCLA a couple years ago when UCLA was number 2 in the country. And UCLA is, a national championship contender every year, probably a little bit better than Penn State. But still, same level. Seeing this sport up close in a small gym, a small packed gym like Daemen, how big these Division I volleyball players are, how tall they are, how high they jump, how hard they hit the ball up close. You really got to be careful if you're sitting in one of the front rows, or you could get hit pretty hard in the face with a volleyball bouncing any which way. It's a sight to behold seeing this sport up close the way you can if you were lucky enough to get a ticket, or that's why I'm going to use my media credential, and I could get into a journalistic rant about this story if we want to. I don't know if we have time for that. And then the Bandits play game 1 of the semifinals at home tonight. They start about the same time, but there's a half an hour difference, so they're going to overlap. But I'm going to try to see some of this match at the start. If Daemen's winning, maybe I stick around. If Penn State's pulling away, then I'm going to get to the Bandits probably after the game starts. But as quick as I can to cover the storylines of that.
What's your media rant regarding your credential?
Well, from what I understand, it's another reason I want to go. I want to see what happens here. I do believe, I could be wrong, but as we are here less than 2 hours before the match, I think Channel 4 WIBB is the only local media outlet covering this. Now, there's probably going to be volleyball media there. There's going to be Daemen media there, and I could be wrong. Some local media could have made a late audible today and decided to cover this.
Maybe somebody will listen to Tim Graham and Friends, brought to them by CTBK.
Perhaps, maybe if we promoted it earlier in the week. But and there's 2 of us going. Gretchen Beyer, our television sports reporter, is going to cover this for television. I'm covering the Bandits tonight, but I'm going to keep my eye on this and maybe write something, especially if Daemen wins. I wrote a preview story already. But so we got 2 people going. And I just don't understand why it's not a bigger story. I mean, it's the NCAA tournament. It's a Division I NCAA tournament. There's a backstory and storyline with Daemen, this new program. That was a well-told story when they started the program, and now here they are.
Has the Buffalo News covered it?
Match. I don't believe the Buffalo News has written an advanced story, and I don't know or was sort of indicated that they had not made credential requests at least. to cover the match tonight. Now, I wouldn't be surprised if I see them there, and God bless them. I give them all the credit in the world if they're there, especially if it's a reporter and a photographer. It might be one or the other, and not with both. They have the same. I should say they have the same conflict with the Bandits, but I don't know the Buffalo News is going to be covering the Bandits tonight either. But I'm not singling out the Buffalo News here either, and I don't want to make this about woohoo Channel 4 is so much better than everybody else. I'm just surprised that there's only one media outlet that thinks that's a big deal. I think the Bandits will get more coverage, although I think I was the only local media person covering the last Bandits home playoff game. That's why I had to pick the 3 stars because there was nobody else to do it. There was no voting. It was a one-person vote. There's another, I think, interesting story going on this week with UB men's tennis and women's tennis playing in the NCAA tournament at Ohio State and both winning the MAC in the same year. I don't think there's been any other media outlet covering that. There's been a lot of stories about Brandon Beane's comments on the radio and follow-ups and analysis. There's been more Bill story. I mean, I know Sean McDermott made a big appearance at Wegmans, and there's been some stuff with the Bills that probably deserves coverage, but I'm just surprised. I mean, Daemen Volleyball did a press conference last night, and I saw the video from one side of it, and I asked Gretchen who else was there, and she said, it was just me. I was the only one asking the questions. They did a good job framing the video to make it look like a well-attended press conference.
I have seen, I mean, I think that a lot of the coverage this week has been holding on to stuff that was said over the weekend by the prospects that the Bills drafted or Beane, and just slotting them on different days and moving on.
Well, nice. I mean, we're going to get another week of that because rookie cap doesn't start until next Friday.
Yeah. Well, get after it, Jonah.
I'm not saying any of that shouldn't be covered. The Bills is a big deal. You do Bills every day. Isn't there something about the Buffalo News and Ralph Wilson and making that agreement that there's a Bills story, Bills headline in the paper every single day? And I think all the local media should probably lead with Bills day after day after day after day. Maybe the Sabres too, but that doesn't mean there's a page 2 in the newspaper and there's a B block or whatever you want to say in sports radio, sports television, even the podcast Twitter sphere. And we're talking tennis and men's volleyball. It's not the biggest sports, but I think they're interesting stories. I think there's other stories with the Bandits and pretty much everything else outside of the Sabres that just seems to get ignored when there's even the slightest, Bills secondary B or C story to tell sometimes.
That's why you're the best, Jonah. You're passionate about these sports and you want them to be covered, and not only covered, but covered well.
I would like somebody else to cover them because maybe I could take a night off and I wouldn't have to write all the stories. If
you wouldn't have to go to Bandits
yeah.
and.
If I was like, they beat me on that story, I guess I don't have to do it now.
All right, wrap up. We got one last college note. I wouldn't know about it, Jonah, if you hadn't told me. I totally missed this too. UB men's and women's tennis qualified for the NCAA tournament, and they're at Ohio State this weekend. Anything to say about that? Or, I mean, the men's team seems like a remarkable story.
That's where I spent my Monday night at the Anchor Bar watching the NCAA selection show for men's tennis, followed by women's tennis, or it was the other way around. And I thought there'd be more media there, and I was the only media person there. But I thought I got a good story out of it. I think it's interesting that both these teams won the MAC championship in the same year. There's only 6 schools in the country that won the conference championship in men's and women's tennis this year. UB's done it once before, but it's only the second time they've done it. And the men's team specifically was 0-10 in conference play last year and turned things around. We're 9-1, won the regular season title, won that. The women won their tournament as the lowest seed. And I had no way to verify this, but it might have never happened before. They both got drawn to play at Ohio State in the first round of 2 different brackets and 2 different bracket processes. But the way they were seeded, 1 through 64, lined up. And now back-to-back days, these programs that are close because they share the same courts and facilities are going to be able to travel together and root for each other and, have this big dance experience, dancing together in the NCAA tournament.
Yeah, 0-10 to 9-1, the men's team. And I know that that's the team record, right? But and then you have the individual aspect of it. But yeah, that's good shit.
Yeah, well, he got coach of the year, Lee Nickel, which is kind of a no-duh. When you're 0-10 the year before and 9-1 this year, it's like you don't even have to really send out those ballots.
Is that in the Mid-American Conference or is that nationally?
No, Mid-American Conference. But he could be.
I was going to say that sounds like the national
yeah,
coach of the year to me
yeah.
too.
And there absolutely could be a regional coach of the year award that he wins and a national coach of the year award that he's, at least a candidate for. Especially if they beat Ohio State in the first round of the NCAA tournament tomorrow, then I think, he's definitely got a case.
All right, Jonah, get your fat bag with all of your Bandits and college volleyball research materials in it. Get on the road and let me know when you're available. Now that I've got my voice back, I'm happy to sit down with you and kibitz about all the sports media goings on that can't be discussed on this podcast.
But it's where sometimes we get our best ideas, and maybe
Right.
There'll be a conversation on next week's podcast that originates from.
Jonah, thanks for this. Thanks to everybody out there for listening and to watching. And let me say that again. I said it, my voice is coming back, but that doesn't mean I'm good at it yet. Thanks to everybody out there for listening to and watching Tim Graham and Friends, brought to you by CTBK, CPAs and Business Consultants. The financial needs of a business go beyond tax and attest services. That's why CTBK goes beyond accounting services and offers outsourced solutions through their affiliation with CFO Solutions Plus. These additional services allow clients to focus on their operational and long-term strategic goals. Trust CTBK's outsourced solutions to provide cost-effective, value-added financial services tailored to your company's needs. Call CTBK at 716-630-2400. Again, 716-630-2400. Or go to ctbk.com to learn more about CTBK's outsourced solutions.